Welcome, everybody, to another episode of What Would the Web Do? Where, as usual, we're joined by Mike Amundsen, and today we'll talk about API versioning. And API versioning is this process where you improve your APIs, which is a good thing, but then you have to manage that, which is an important thing. And we'll talk about patterns of how to do that. So how would the web do that, and how can you learn from that for your own API practice? So let's jump right into it. Mike, what is API versioning?
Right. So here's the way I talk about it. API versioning is a technique, right? It's a technique for handling the changes, the improvements you were talking about on your API. And it's specifically an issue where how you want to improve your API after it's been released to production. I think that's the really big change. So the real challenge, I think, is change over time. So it deals with time, it deals with lots of connections. It's easy to make a change to your API if you're the only one using it. It's much harder if there are thousands of people using it, especially if they're people you've never met. So versioning, or version numbers is usually how this works, is just one possible way to handle that change over time problem, or sort of discoordinated change or anarchic change, however you want to look at it. That's the way I think of versioning.
And it's an interesting thing to look at, I think, from the perspective you were just mentioning, in the sense that on the one hand, you want your APIs to be used by as many consumers as possible, right? This is almost like one of the goals that you have with your API. On the other hand, you kind of make it harder for yourself to make any changes when you've kind of reached success on that axis.
Absolutely.
And I think that's the interesting part there, right? That on the one hand, you have these conflicting goals. Like, I want to have as many people as possible, but I also want to make sure that I don't make them unhappy when I make changes, which I want to do. So what are the typical things that people are doing?
Yeah, so I think we hit on one of the first ones, which is just version numbering. I think the most common way I see people handling a changed API is they create a new URL that has like a v1 in it, or a v2 or something like that. So basically you kind of fork your API. You end up with, API version 1 and API version 2, and the URLs are different. So I think that's the most common way to do it. So you find that in lots of places. But there are other ones too. So there are some that use a header. So there's actually a not used very often, but there's actually a version header from a long time ago. I don't see it used very often, but sometimes people will put version numbers in headers. Or I've seen people do version numbers with a media type. They use like a very strongly typed media type, like api.customer.json or something, and they might tack a v1 or a v2 or a v colon or something like that onto it. So typically it's some kind of numbering scheme that is added to the communication request format. So it's either in the URL or the header or something like that. Stripe, for example, has a pretty extensive model. They don't actually just use numbers, they actually use dates. So version numbers like 2021-04-07, I think .1 or 2 or 3 or something. They have a pretty extensive system for doing this, and they do it mostly in headers.
So one of the things that I like to say, and I'm wondering what you think about that, is that in my mind, people often obsess a little bit over, like, which of these ways that you were just describing, which of these ways do we pick? And they spend surprising amounts of time deciding on that one. And what I typically say is just pick one. It's a different name, it's a different thing. There's no magic in any of those ways. As long as you're, let's say, you're doing it consistently for your own APIs, it's okay. Just pick one. Or do you have a preference for any of those?
So, first of all, I think the notion of just pick one and be consistent is actually really valuable because most people will appreciate that. I personally like doing it in the URL because to me, it seems like it's the hardest one to miss and it's the hardest one to ignore. So I think especially from a consumer standpoint, if I see that there's a V1 or a V2, then I've got to adjust my URLs or URIs and keep it straight. Some people don't like that because that means if you make a change, then I've got to change my URLs. But I think that's really sort of the smart strategy. So I prefer the URL version of that. How about you? What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's the most pragmatic choice, so to speak. I always feel a little uneasy about it because, like you said, right, it changes the identity of everything, which is a really, really big change. And if you have really persistent identifiers for things that are important, right, like customer identifiers, product identifiers, these kind of things, then I think it does become problematic. It does become this issue where, yeah, you're breaking all identities that you have. And if somebody remembers those and wants to use them again and so forth, it becomes really hard to manage that. But yeah, that's just, I think, unavoidable in that pattern. And I still think that's the one that most people are using, and you can manage those things. You just have to be aware of them. So yeah, that's my take on this particular thing.
The identifier thing is a really, really good point that I hadn't really thought about in terms of long term. So if your API exists over years and years, and you keep changing the URL, you're actually changing cached identifiers and things like that. That could be costly. That's a really good point.
Identity is so important, right? And I think we talk about the web so much on this segment, right? And I think that's one of the things that is really, really at the core of why the web is so successful, because it is all based on identity. And it's really valuable for me to be able to share a URI, which actually may not be such a big thing to work across time, but also I can save it, I can remember it, I can go back to it. And that, I think, is also very valuable. That ideally, right, there's this very old article by Tim Berners-Lee, right? Cool URIs don't change, right? Yeah. That's one of the classics, I think, that everybody actually should read. And of course, right, this does get violated all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of my URIs are not cool.
Yeah. These are not cool, right? Breaking URIs is really not cool, but it happens. So yeah, I think it is a very deep concept of the web that identity is important, and that identity and access are kind of tightly coupled, right? That makes many things easier. But it also means that then you have to remember that this is how things work, right? And maybe engineer around it.
Yep, I think so.
So then would you say that, given that there are different options in the API space, that this is a solved problem? So, just pick one and do it like this and everything's going to be great?
Well, so my short answer is no. Actually, I don't think it is, because of what you just said about access and identity. Because I think what happens is, if we get in this habit of generating new versions every time something changes, we really proliferate an awful lot, and we can actually make it pretty challenging. One of the habits I see people do is they do use, say, one of these versioning methods, but then what they do is they say, well, we'll have a version in beta, we'll have a version in production, and then we'll have one previously old version. But every time we shift, we turn off some version. So what happens is you're constantly kind of decommissioning clients. You're breaking the API for some version, some portion of your community. And especially if you go back to this idea where if it's just me, it's fine. But if it's hundreds and hundreds of other companies, it's not so fine. You're putting a lot of additional effort into the whole process. So I've got to manage version numbers. I've got to make sure I know which client is using which version. There's an awful lot that you add into it. So I think this idea of naming every change gets pretty costly along the way. So shutting down old versions can cause problems. Adding too many versions can cause problems. A good example is Salesforce. Salesforce has this habit of releasing a new version of their API every 4 months, 3 times a year. But it's really important to them that they don't break anybody. So they keep old versions around. And the last time I checked, which I think was a couple of weeks ago, they were on version 50 of their API, and they supported back to version 30. So they were supporting 20 simultaneous versions of their API, because every time somebody calls an API at Salesforce, they get paid. The last thing they want to do is break it. But that's a huge expense. Can you imagine keeping track of 20 versions and supporting them and documenting them and bug fixing them? So I think we sometimes make this harder than we need to be. I think there's a better way to handle this change over time than just labeling every change as a version. I don't know. What do you, I mean, you've been through a lot of this as well. What are you thinking on that?
Well, I'm wondering what the web would do. Since that is what we want to get to, right? But you're right. I mean, I find the Salesforce example fascinating, right? Where they have certainly turned that into an art form, so to speak, right? Really managing that effectively. And they went through this process of balancing those two things, right? And say, we want to promise to consumers that the API you use will be exactly the same that you signed up for, and we'll make it work for you, right? And that's a promise that I'm sure a lot of people kind of like, but it's a promise that has a price tag attached to it, right? But I think they have, it seems like they have figured out how to work it, and it works. It's operationally, I'm sure it's not trivial, but you can make it happen, right? But then there's the other version of that.
Yes.
Where you could ask yourself, right, what would the web do? So what would the web do?
Yeah, so I think one of the things, if we look back at the history of the web, is about 30 years and in some version or another, 25, 30 years. There are always changes, but there's so much effort put into making these changes backward compatible, to making sure, especially when you're on the level of the web, this is sort of planetary or global scale consumption, of making sure that we go through things and take the time to make sure they're not going to break. All the way back to I think it was at least the 80s, might have been the 70s. There's the robustness principle from John Postel from TCP/IP, which is be conservative in what you do and liberal in what you accept. So be careful to craft a really good message. But if you get a message that's not quite right, or it's a little bit different, if you can make it work, go ahead. That whole idea of making it work, if you can make it work safely, is built into the way the web works. Think about, if you'd have to change your browser every time TCP/IP changed or HTTP changed, it would never have scaled the way it does. HTTP went through all this work in creating this upgrade. We call it the dance, right? This whole process of I asked for an upgrade to another version, if you can give it to me, and then there are certain response codes and all these other things. It's a very, very complex system. So it was built into the protocol to do that. I find that amazing. And then just the whole idea of ignoring stuff you don't understand, which is what HTML adopted. You can add all sorts of crazy tags in a document, and it just gets ignored by the browser. If you add additional attributes on a tag, it gets ignored by the browser. So there are all of these ways of I look at them as sort of self-defense. Like if things are unexpected, I'm going to defend myself. I'll ignore things I don't understand. I'll try to arrange a process where we can negotiate versions in real time, which I find amazing from HTTP. And from just the very message level, I'll always try to, if I can, try to use the message best I can. Otherwise, I'll have to reject it. I think that's pretty extensive change over time support from the web, right?
Oh yeah, and I think I call these things processing models. A well-defined model where I tell you have to do it like this, and 1 year from now you also have to do it like this, and 2 years and 5 years from now, right? Because things may change, but there's a well-defined way how you have to process them. And personally, I always like HTML. I always thought that's kind of genius, right? This idea that if there's a new element, you ignore the element, but you render the contents of the element, element, right? And like you said, right, if there's attributes, I don't know, you ignore the attributes. And if you look at, the robustness that this built into the ways how HTML was able to evolve, and how then, you could build these web pages that were still kind of working in old browsers as well as possible, but they actually had a much richer content in them that in newer browsers would allow new features to be used. That I always found that one of the most elegant parts actually of how that works on the web, like the HTML model.
I think, when I think about it, this whole principle of ignoring what you don't understand and just rendering it as text, that's what I call a forward compatible principle. Like moving forward, if people add things that you're unexpecting, this is what you're supposed to do. And then there's the backward compatible idea, which is change things in a way that don't break existing promises, like don't change the meaning of an anchor tag or a form tag. You can add new things, but you can't, you can't modify them in some other way. And this also, I think, points to something that you had been talking about, which I thought was kind of brilliant. And that is, we're talking about APIs here today, but we just use the example of HTML, which is primarily consumed by humans. It's meant for humans to kind of sort out. So what's a breaking change for a human is not the same thing as a breaking change for a machine, right? They're very different.
Yes, humans are definitely more error tolerant, or like they're better at like dealing with changes, right? And can say, yeah, this looks different, but it kind of looks like the thing that I'm used to, so I'm expecting it works the same way, right? And machines, of course, are much more binary in the world. And it's like, well, this is spelled differently, so I have no idea what that is.
Yeah. The letter's off, so yeah.
Yeah, right. So machines, that definitely they are a little less forgiving in the way they deal with things. But I think we still have kind of chances to, we don't have to completely give up, right? And say it's like, well, because machines are stupid, we can't do any planning for versioning. So, looking at the versioning for machines and what the web is doing, what would you say as an API designer, and also maybe as somebody overseeing API landscapes? What would you recommend that they focus on so that the versioning issue finds a good balance between APIs can evolve, but machines don't see too much breakage? What would be good guidelines?
Yeah, and I think it's really important. You just mentioned another thing that we talk about a lot on this segment, which is the landscape. Often you're not talking about just one API. You're talking about hundreds, maybe thousands of APIs. How do you sort of create some compatibility or consistency in that realm as well? And I kind of developed a set of patterns or sort of principles that I use. The first one I sort of claim is this sort of Hippocratic oath of APIs. It's like, first, do no harm. Don't be really conscious of the consumer, of the API consumers and other people trying to produce APIs with your design. And don't introduce breaking changes or things that would make it easier to break. Try to think ahead. So that's sort of the first one. And the other one is that I often talk about is the sort of these three rules. When you're making a change, don't take anything away. Don't remove a URL. Don't remove something in a response. Don't remove something in the message or something like that, the request or the reply. Don't change the meaning of things. Don't change the meaning of the third argument from the number of people to the number of pages or something like that, because these are all breaking elements. And then finally, if you add something, like you add a new field in a form, make it optional. Don't make it required, because if you make it required, you've kind of broken everybody. So by sort of adopting those kinds of steps, try not to break anybody, and then use these principles, I think we're kind of mimicking what the web does, because I think that's really the robustness principle and the ignore unknowns. That sort of follows the same way. And I think also as an API consumer, I adopt certain principles as well. Like I don't use strong schema validation on inbound messages. One of the things that I learned from the XSD world, from the XML world, is strong typing of inbound messages means even if you reorder the things in a message, it's going to fail. It's going to error out. One of the things I like about JSON schema is JSON schema by design ignores new elements in a message unless you flip a bit which says, additional elements equals false. So I think JSON schema kind of learned from XSD, and it's a little bit easier. So as a consumer, I try not to use schemas. I actually try to read the code carefully, and I try to ignore things that I don't understand and still process messages. So that way, if somebody changes my message or changes some aspect of the request or something like that, then I don't end up, breaking my client automatically. That's a lot of work, but I think that brings us closer to what the web would do. That's kind of the way I look at it.
Yeah, I like all of that. I think it's kind of good practice nowadays, I think, to do that kind, right? And also to follow some patterns for the version numbers, make them meaningful. Semantic versioning, for example, comes to mind.
Yeah, we haven't talked about that at all, right?
Yeah. One thing I would like to ask you, because we also didn't talk about that at all, is even if you follow all these nice patterns that you were just saying, what about Hyrum's law?
Right, Hyrum's law. You've done a piece with Hyrum, right?
With the Hyrum, yes.
With the Hyrum's law.
Hyrum.
So, and you'll correct me. So Hyrum's law is, even if you say something's going to change, don't depend on this. Even if you say that, somebody's going to write, some client, some API consumer that depends on the tiniest little bit of your API. And if you change it, you're likely to break somebody. Isn't that sort of the sum up of what Hyrum's law is about?
Yeah, I think the official phrasing is, if you have enough consumers, there will always be somebody who depends on observable behavior, right? So for example, if you always sort your results in a certain way, even though you never promised that you would sort it, somebody starts saying, well, it's sorted, why should I sort it?
Yeah.
And then when you don't sort it anymore in your response, right, suddenly somebody breaks because they don't sort it. And so that's the kind of breakage that might happen, because people just depend on stuff that you never promised, but it worked for them, and then they started depending on it.
That actually brings up something else that we haven't really discussed, and that is the idea of observable behavior. That's not necessarily documented. It's just something I noticed. I noticed you sort this all the time. Drop-down lists, like contents of drop-down lists, right? Enumerated types. Set the status to one of 4 types. If I change the one of 4 types, if I rearrange the order of those 1 or 4 types, if I remove one of them, right? So it's any observable behavior. It's not just the design. It's sort of anything I happen to notice from one particular implementation of the API, right?
Actually, now that you're saying that with a drop-down list, I think we have a good topic for our next segment. Because what you just said reminded me, like, think of RPA, right? Robotic process automation, right? Which is exactly that thing, right? It depends on observable behavior. I basically program a machine to act like a browser, right? And it knows that I need to go through the 3rd item in the drop-down list because that's what I need to do. And then when the drop-down list changes, everything breaks, right? Even though you never said, this is going to be the drop-down list, right? I promised that forever. So I think it's really interesting, right, to see that, where you could say, whenever you have these people, or like actors, right? Actors following just their own understanding of what's going on, then they might make choices that you didn't even know, right? And Hyrum actually has like these nice examples of very strange things where some things broke because of almost like unimaginable little details, right? They depended on stuff that you would never have thought about and that nobody would ever document, right? So that's so I think my takeaway from Hyrum is always like, yes, do all the things that the web would do, but still be prepared for the fact that, yes, bad things can still happen because people don't necessarily are creating code that is as robust as you want it to be. And because you didn't document everything, because you can't document everything.
Yeah. And it's even to the point where if you're writing a sort of a generalized specification, 2 different implementations might have different observable behaviors, that if I wrote a client for one, I would observe that behavior. If I go to that other API that's supposed to be the exact same spec, I might have some breakage, right? Because the observable behavior from two implementations might be different. This is, you're right. This is a whole nother show.
Yes, this is a whole nother show, but it really is the difference between what do I actually implement and what do I kind of promise in my contract, and how detailed is it, right?
Yeah,
but I think it's still,
But I was going to say, now, can you fix that? Can you improve that with this use of semantic versioning, right? We haven't talked about semantic versioning. I typically just say version 1, version 2, version 3, but that's not really what semantic versioning does, right?
No, semantic versioning doesn't really help you. Semantic versioning at that point, it just is a way of how you as a producer use these version numbers to say, I think this is a non-breaking change, and I think this is a breaking change, right? But whereas in reality, if you're really a true believer in Hyrum's law, right, you would say any change is a breaking change for somebody.
Yep.
Right, because somebody might be tripped up by this because they did something maybe stupid, but they still did it. So it might break somebody. So yeah, semantic versioning at that point really doesn't help you. It communicates your intention, but it doesn't really reflect what might be happening out there.
Right.
It's still something that I recommend to use, but it doesn't solve the problem, so to speak.
Very good. Very good. Yep. Okay.
Well, I think we've covered it all about versioning and the web.
So what's next for us? What are we going to do next for us?
I don't know. We could break from our mold and actually pick a topic for next time.
I don't know. Can we commit to that? Are we confident enough, or are we going to break
it? Well, if I would. I could be very, very daring and say, let's look at RPA. I like RPA, robotic process automation, right?
Yeah.
It's something that also happens a lot on the web.
Absolutely.
Now it happens a lot in the API space. It just has a fancy name to it. It used to be, I say, even though people don't like it when I say it, I say it used to be screen scraping, and that wasn't sexy enough. So now it's called RPA.
That's exactly right.
But anyway, yeah. So yeah, we can do that. Let's commit to that. RPA next time.
Works for me.
Great. Okay. Thanks so much for being on the show again. If you liked what you saw, please give it a thumbs up. If you have any comments, please let us know. Subscribe to the channel, and see you next time for RPA. What would the web do?